So while I mentioned that I stated that men really couldn't compete with women in fashion because since women's dress was more complicated, changed more drastically, men's clothing underwent a more subtle changes, but just changes that lasted much longer than that of women. So sorry. Although neither of the components of men's dress changed, so they still wore coats and waistcoats and breeches, later trousers. Their silhouettes weren't radically altered. Really, what changed were the colors that they used and the luxurious fabrics and some of the lavish embroidery. And when we looked at, you know, the French Revolution, we see how different that was, how different, or excuse me, how organized it was, what you wore based on what your political beliefs did. But the French Revolution really did divide the sexes in terms of their clothing. Men's clothing became, plain in design and somber in color. It was unadorned with decoration. It just really symbolized an indifference to luxury, which had not happened up until this period, where really men were just as ostentatious as women. They were just as gaudy and decorated and embroidered. And England really led the change for that somber attire. And although British dress for some time have really been less formal or classless, that began to change, right? So we see men in what we still know today as formal dress. There also in this period is what the term is known as a dandy. There's a video that I'm going to actually show in this class. Actually, one of your classmates, one of the classmates, turned me on to of a man that lives as a Regency dandy in present day. In 2020, he lives as a dandy. So fashionable men where they dress well. They're circulating the best, societal groups. They were always ready, with that witty comment. I talked about the regent being known as the first gentleman of Europe, and that was very important. And men were proper as well. So we do see some difference in some of the garments that they wear. And one of the things that we see on this image, we see the two gentlemen at the top, that they were wearing cravats. They're just large squares of fabrics that are folded, wrapped several times around the neck, tied in front, the precursor to what a tie was going to be. But they were lace. They were lace, and very refined. We also see in this image, so they have their shirt open, and they have around them, the neckband of the shirt is called a stock. It's a stiff neckband that buckled or tied behind the waist. We also see a coat. We see a waistcoat. We see breeches or trousers that made up a suit, like literally a suit, right? This is the first time those words were used as that. So, there also was, dress for formal occasions and less formal occasions, and they usually differed in color, quality of fabric, buttons, accessories. We moved away from the ditto suit. Rarely were three parts of a suit the same color. Generally, they contrasted. They were either light and dark or bright and subdued. Wool was used very, very often. And if we look at this image on the right, we see a blue tailcoat and trousers, which by 1820 were more widely worn than knee breeches. And the trousers were actually held in place by a strap underneath the shoe. So a stirrup, but the stirrup actually went underneath the shoe and hooked onto the heel. So we see that coats, generally end at the waist, and they curve gradually back from the waist into two tails ending ending slightly above the knee. Sometimes they had a cut in, sometimes they had a rounded square space, but they were short in front, long in the back, right? So what does it say for a mullet? Business up front, party in the back, right? We also see that collars generally had a notch collar where it joined the lapel. Sometimes we might see velvet applied to those notch collars, and the closing of your garment could be either single or double-breasted, and oftentimes they had a false flap. So this is formal dress, right? So we see the cravat and we see the stock. The other thing that we see is the pantaloon. So we see the trousers with the strap, but the gentlemen on the left are wearing pantaloons, and they were just a tight fitting trouser, right? A leg that was more closely fitted than trousers. And they were what were generally worn by across all classes, right? So middle, upper, and lower classes would wear pantaloons. So these were the typical garments for men in the earliest part of this 50-year period. All right, so moving on in this era, we're going to get to the next part, so the next 20-year period. And although men's clothing had become a little bit more subdued in color and ornamentation, there were subtle details in cut and style that really marked the dress of the man that wanted to be fashionable, right? So there's a variety of minor changes that happened, and shirts were generally cut with deep collars, where you could fold the cravat over. Again, we talked um, about the stick neckline. Shirts, day shirts and evening shirts were different, right? So we talked about women's different dressing for different times of the day. Men had that same they followed that same path. But either shirt, men, daytime shirts were generally tucked in at insets at the front, and evening shirts had shirts that were a little bit more frilly. Sleeves were cuffed. They were closed with buttons or studs. Men wore stocks still. Sometimes they were black, or they would be white. So the image that we see, the man at the bottom left, he has on a black stock and a white cravat, and then he has an overcoat over it. So still, coats, waistcoats, trousers were still components. Tailcoats still existed. Frock coats were still there, even though the variation of the frock coats, if we look at the coat that the man's wearing here, is much more styling, were more military inspired. They oftentimes they had a rolled or a standing lapel, and riding coats had really wide, large lapels. Also, waistcoats were worn either under or an outer coat. So the arrangements would vary based on what the gentleman was doing. The terms trousers and pantaloons were really used interchangeably, but again, they were more close fitting. They often had the ankle strap that we saw earlier, or they might be laced to fit. And oftentimes it was more fashionable to use a different color for each part of the costume. I mean, each part of the outfit. So if we see a white pant and then a different color jacket. If we look at the image of the gentleman on the bottom, so we see different colors for different components. When we move on to the next period, so the 40s through the end, we see the same components. We see suit, we see waistcoat, trousers. Coat styles generally were, a tailcoat or a frock style. We do see um, we see some relaxation, though. Again, when we talked about garments worn throughout the day, the image that we see of the man here is wearing what would be kind of a morning coat, a dressing gown, right? So getting dressed, which you would get dressed to get dressed, right? Sounds silly, but paisley pattern fabrics were widely used, and these garments were made from a wide range of ornamental fabric. But we see this ornament as much more subdued, again, compared to what we had seen in previous eras, with men wearing patterns as high ornamentation. So also, in terms of the outer garments that men wore, there's a little laundry list that is going to be under this section of the lecture. Throughout the course of this class, I have not talked at all about children's garments, because they really just mimic women's garments for the most part, and they were relatively unisex. But we see children of the late 17th, sorry, the late 18th century, early 19th century. They have escaped from wearing the same thing for forever, right? So we see this image, children's clothing tended to be age specific, not gender specific. Traditionally, children dressed in less constricting less constricting adult style. So pretty much what their mother wore is what they wore as well. So both, boys and girls wore garments that were similar, right? They all wore dresses and breeches. We see the pantaloons in the image here, but until about the age 5 or 6, most boys were still dressed in a skirt, right, or a skirted garment. And we do see here that about age 5 or 6, they were starting to put into trousers, and were also put into actual suits. So we do see a change here as well. We see a change towards gender specific garments for really young children. And part of the reason why there were no gender specific garments previously is that, the families recycled, right? They had hand-me-downs, so it's easier to hand down a unisex garment than, have to buy garments for every person in your household. And we've seen how in this time we're so fortunate now that folks only had one or two, just a handful of changes of clothes. Regular people only had a handful of changes of clothing. So it was just inevitable that if the mother was making baby clothes, she was going to make clothes that could be reused by her next child and the child after that, regardless of their gender. So there has actually been recent scholarly interest in the clothing of the enslaved people in the South, and this, clothing has provided some insight into what what their daily life looked like. And there are very few depictions before the Civil War of slaves. They were property, so they just didn't take a picture of them. So and the images that we do have often just show the downtroddenness. I'm sorry, that was a really long pause, but it showed the downtroddenness. Or were just depictions for runaway slaves, so notices for runaway slaves, and to describe what they're wearing in detail. So underneath this part of the lecture, there also is a document that has a description of what slaves wore Fabrics that the slaves wore were harsh, and they were generally what is known as homespun. So they were garments that were made at home. They were fabric textiles that were made at home. So the textile was made in the home, as well as the garment itself, which, as we talked about, moving towards this industrial, more mechanized world, wasn't necessarily the case anymore. So they were homespun, or they were purchased from manufacturers who provided the cheapest, meanest cloth for slavery. And it actually was known as Negro cloth. It was, it was coarse, and it was used for slaves in the American, in the South. How slaves were dressed more fashionably, and sometimes they even were allowed the hand-me-downs from their owners. So, no attention to niceties of style or fabric was given to those that were working in the field. So fabrics generally weren't dyed unless the wearer did them themselves. Like I said, fabric was harsh. It was coarse. It was uncomfortable, and generally, slaves were given 2 outfits a year. So one outfit was to be worn in the warm months, and one in the cold months. And generally, they weren't even provided with 2 outfits. They were allotted the material to make these clothes. So, slaveholders held great records. That's the one thing that they did do. And one plantation owner said that he gave his slaves 6 yards of woolen cloth and 6 yards of cotton cloth, that Negro cloth, for the summer. So a needle, a skein of thread, and half a dozen buttons. Period. That's all you have. But this information is not, his diary was not universal. But 6 yards of cloth is what you had to make all of your clothes for the winter and all of your clothes for the summer. So again, garments generally weren't dyed unless the slave did it themselves. And fortunately, coming from Africa, they had dyed before us, right? So materials such as indigo or tree bark or poison ivy, things that they could plants that they can get their hands on, they were able to do. They were able to dye. But specifically, slave women wore a frock or a robe, something that was simple, sleeveless, collarless bodice joined to the skirt. If it had sleeves, they were short and they were loose. The neck was, just took that variety of shapes, V, square. Skirt lengths varied from below the knee to the top of, to just not grazing the ground, but just to the top of the foot. Because again, these had to be functional. They had to be functional garments. Enslaved males wore loose-fitting tunics, shirts that were cut to require as little sewing as possible. And on top of that, and then the bottom piece was, some form of pantaloon or short breeches. But generally, they were not allowed to wear trousers, in part because they just didn't have enough fabric to wear their trousers. But even people that are enslaved, just much like people that are in jail, right? They still find a way to decorate and personalize their garments. So they did things, by adding trim to have some individualistic style, purchasing extra cloth, if they were able to earn any extra money, and they did what they could with what they had, right? When we get to their freedom in the next section, because we're going to hit the Civil War, in that next section, we'll talk about what the formerly enslaved people do when we get into that next period.